Our title tonight, Origins, Is It Reasonable to Believe in God in the Scientific Age, is a follow-up to last night's lesson. If you weren't here last night, I'm so sorry. I will do a little bit of review tonight, but then we're going to proceed on with our topic for this evening. These things are recorded, so you can look back and study further on your own. So, let's start again this evening. Okay, I got to turn that on. We'll get it all together here in a minute. I want to turn to Romans 1:20 again as we begin this evening. That is the theme passage for this series. And as I mentioned last night, if I were doing this series in a chemistry lecture hall on a college campus, I would not be using the Bible at all, because my approach this evening is a scientific approach. So I want to take just a minute and explain that to you a little further. It is my judgment, when you're dealing with a topic like this, if you're going to have any influence on someone who doesn't believe in God, it doesn't do much good to quote the Bible. If a person doesn't even believe God exists, why would he believe when you're quoting a book that claims to be God's Word? I think you need to start with those folks with the evidence of the natural world. And my point about this is, Romans, the first chapter, uses that same kind of reasoning. And it's in the Bible. Most everybody here tonight is a Bible believer, I suspect. And so I think it's appropriate in this setting to start with that, because I want all you Bible believers in this audience to recognize that the kind of reasoning we're going to do tonight is supported by the biblical text. But I am not starting with the Bible. Maybe you watched the debate between Ken Ham and Bill Nye, the science guy, some years ago. I lasted about 30 minutes in that debate. And the reason is, I felt like it was a complete waste of time. Because Ken Ham's approach was to take the Bible as the Word of God as his starting place, and then show how the Bible explains science. That was his approach. Bill Nye's approach was to look at the evidence of the natural world. And folks, those are two different approaches. If you start with the Bible, you're starting with a revelation from God that says this is the way it is. That's not the way science works. So if you're going to debate a scientist who doesn't even believe in God, it seems to me inappropriate to start with the Bible as the Word of God. That's my opinion. Okay? I thought those guys were like this. And so the debate didn't accomplish much, in my opinion. Kind of wished I could have been up there. But I didn't get invited. So what I'm doing tonight, class, please understand, is teaching you a class in science. And my view is this: the testimony God has left us in the natural world is another powerful testimony to His existence. You do not have to have this book to become a believer in God. You listening? And what does Romans 1:20 say? For since the creation of the world, His invisible attributes are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even His eternal power and Godhead. So the passage teaches that you can see the invisible God in the things that are made. That, ladies and gentlemen, is the ancient argument from design. If you examine the natural world and everywhere you look you see design, it clearly leads to an inference that there was a designer. And that designer we call God. That's the argument. So I'm saying to you again this evening, the arguments I'm making in this series, Monday night, Tuesday night, and Wednesday night, which ought to go on for the next 6 months, or several years, are the argument from design. That's what it's about. So I'm trying to convince you, if you're not already convinced, there's design everywhere you look. And it's founded firmly on an argument that the Bible itself makes. So on behalf of all of you Bible believers, I have shown you that the Bible is supporting what I'm going to do next, but we're not going to use the Bible. So please don't be offended. Because we're instead going to turn to God's other book, which is a grand testimony of his existence. I hope that's clear. Because I've had the occasion when I did things like this in a church building to have folks meet me in the back and say, "You didn't use any Bible hardly. What are you doing talking about this stuff in a church building?" I hope I just explained that to you. Now, where would I rather be? I'd rather be in a science classroom. Because here's another reason, and you tried to do this, by the way, if you didn't know it. They tried to rent a hall at Furman University here, and it didn't work out. Another reason I like that is because there you do not have to be concerned about whether you're doing certain Bible things. You're just going to teach science. And in my mind, teaching pure science is equivalent to testifying to God. And you can do it without the Bible, because there's plenty of testimony. All right, I took too long about that, but I'm not taking anything out of my lesson. But I thought it was important again to lay that groundwork. So last night I mentioned to you that there's an organization called SETI, S-E-T-I, Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence, that is still functioning today. This is their website. And the first sentence there is, SETI is an exploratory science that seeks evidence of life in the universe by looking for some signature of its technology. And I told you last night that what they're looking for is radio signals, narrow band radio signals that contain information. And were they to find that, according to them, that would be powerful evidence that there's intelligent life out there in the universe. Why is that? Because they know good and well nature would never do such a thing. It required intelligence acting upon nature to send narrow band radio signals with information in it. You with me? So I thought I'd build on that a little bit tonight. Here's a book I was required to read at Harvard University in one of my classes. I had a class on astronomy with one of the foremost radio astronomers of his day, and by the way, he was involved in SETI. That was 1967. And the title of this book is Intelligent Life in the Universe by I.S. Shklovsky and Carl Sagan. And the whole book is filled with why we believe there's likelihood of having intelligent life out there is very strong. Because back in the 60s, ladies and gentlemen, folks really believed there was intelligent life out there. And we'd find it eventually. And so they wrote a whole book on what it might look like, and what are the kinds of things we would look like from them, and what should we send out there in the way of signals from Earth so they might find us. And there's a whole set of chapters in there on what kind of evidence we might find in the universe to convince us that there's intelligent life out there. And one of those I'm going to refer to tonight, as you will see. Oh, I just wanted you to know, highly respected scientists wrote this book. It was required reading at Harvard in 1967. Have they found any such evidence to this day in 2019? No, they have not. There is not one scintilla of evidence of intelligent life in the universe other than right here. Don't you believe these people about all these little green men? But are they looking? Yes, they are. Did you see this movie? How many have seen the movie Contact? Okay, several. So you can help me with this. This is a class, so you're allowed to answer. Todd, did you raise your hand? I figured you'd seen this. Now, here's my next question. How many of you have read the book? Nobody. Is that typical of our age or what? And by the way, God sent us a book, not a video. Just thrown in there free of charge. Contact was a book written by, guess who? Carl Sagan. In his lifetime, Carl has passed from this life. And I suspect he knows a whole lot more than he knew when he was alive about God. But they didn't find one scintilla of evidence of intelligent life in the universe while he was alive, and they still haven't. So he wrote a book where they did. It's the book Contact. And those of you that have seen it, did they make contact or did they find something they thought was from intelligent life? Do you remember? Yes, they did. In fact, here it is. That looks intelligent, doesn't it? Let me blow it up for you. That's a series of radio signals that, according to the book Contact, which is fiction, they received this signal from outer space. Does that look like intelligence to you? Well, I want to show you some things. Let's watch it. I'm going to underline. You see those two little number ones there? Those number ones stand for bleeps on a radio telescope. The zeros stand for pauses. Okay? So, two bleeps, right? And a pause. Let's go to the next one. How many is that? Three bleeps and a pause. How many is that? 5 bleeps and a pause. Next one is, how many is that one? Can you count it? 7 bleeps and a pause. Next one, can you count them? That's 11 bleeps. Anybody want to guess what the next one is? 13. Thank you. Anybody want to guess what the next one is? 17. Have you figured out what that is? Those are the prime numbers. You great mathematicians in this room, you remember what a prime number is? That's a number that's divisible only by itself and 1. Right? Is the number 5 a prime number? It's divisible by 5 and what else? 1. That's a prime number. What you have on here, class, went ahead and gave you the next. What's the next one after 17? 19. You have prime numbers. In fact, you have the first 25 prime numbers in a row. 2, 3, 5, 7, 11, 13, 17, 19, all the way up to 101 is the 25th prime number. Did you know 101 is only divisible by 1 and 101? You didn't know that. Did you know that? Well, good. And so on this signal they received from outer space, they said, the signal contains in it the first 25 prime numbers in a row. Yeah, but that's not it's not a whole number. So, you see, what do you think they concluded in this fictional story? Somebody intelligent did that. That didn't just come about by the stars bleeping out the first 25 prime numbers in a row, right? Did you know that in this book by Carl Sagan, one of the predictors he has in here that would indicate intelligent life out there is if we got a signal with the first 25 prime numbers? So he made up a story where you did get that. And look, if we really did get a signal from outer space with the first 25 prime numbers in a row in the signal, what would you think? Isn't it interesting how stars bleep that out? Nobody would think that. That had to come from an intelligent source. So I don't disagree with Sagan's reasoning. The problem is we haven't found any such thing in outer space. But they did in this movie. And their conclusion was, well, I'll get to that in a minute. I want to introduce you to another interesting book. It's called The Design Inference. It's by William Dembski. He has a PhD in philosophy and in mathematics. He's a brilliant guy. And in this book, he investigates mathematically how you can determine if something is designed. Not everything is designed, folks. Some things come about by natural causes. So he has in this book a description of what he calls the only three possibilities for a given event. So let's take the event I just told you about. A signal from outer space that contains the first 25 prime numbers. That's an event, if that really happened. He said there are only three possibilities. It either had to occur, that it was inevitable, or it was an accident, took place by chance, or it was designed. That's his position in this book. So how do you decide? He said you need to ask three key questions. Now, folks, I'm about to summarize this entire book in just a couple of minutes. So please understand, you need a whole lot more information, but I'm going to summarize. He says, here's the funnel. Take the event you're looking at and ask this question. Is it contingent? That means, did it have to happen or could it have happened some other way? And you ask yourself the question, yes or no, is it contingent? If it is not contingent, then it was inevitable. It had to happen. So the event I just showed you, do you think that's the only way a star could bleep? Or radio signals could be sent? Well, there's an infinite number of ways radio signals could be sent, aren't there? So it's certainly a contingent event. So the answer to that question is yes, it's contingent. Didn't have to happen. The second question you need to ask is it complex enough that it didn't happen by chance? Well, that's the hardest question. And most of this book is discussing the chance of probability here. So is the event so complicated that it could not have happened by chance? That's the question. If the answer to that is yes, then you go to the next question. I would say to you, radio signals containing the first 25 prime numbers in a row is pretty complex. The chances of that happening by random accidental happenings are so slim, it's essentially zero. Wouldn't you agree? That requires much more mathematical analysis than that. But I'm going to say the answer to that question is yes also. It's too complex to be by chance. But then he says, Dembski says, you need to ask a third question. Does it contain specified information? Specified. In other words, could you come up with that information by some other means ahead of time? Like, could you say in this book, as Sagan does, if we could get a signal with the first 25 prime numbers in a row, that would be a powerful evidence for design. That's specified information. Class, could you generate the first 25 prime numbers if I ask you? Yes, you could. Let's work on it. Is 2 a prime number? Because it's divisible by 2 and 1, right? Is 3 a prime number? Yes. How about 4? No, because it's divisible by 4, 2, and 1. That's not a prime number. How about 5, 6, 7, 8, 9? No. 9's divisible by 9, 3, and 1. That's not a prime number. How about 10? Not a prime number. 11? Yes. 12? 13? Yes. 14? 15? 16? 17? Yes. 18? No. Could you generate the first 25 prime numbers in a row? Of course you could. You're smart enough to do that. That's specified information, class. Dembski's point is, if the information contained in this event is specified, if the answer to that question is yes, you can be 99.9% certain that it's designed. And you can analyze every piece of that mathematically. I like it because I teach math. His point is, you look at events in nature, things that take place in nature, and you can come up with a mathematical analysis that answers the question, did this have to be designed? And in the movie Contact, that's exactly what they did. They said, this thing is certainly contingent, it is complex beyond belief, and it was specified in advance, right? Therefore, they concluded it's designed. I'm going to back up to that again. The scientists in Carl Sagan's fictional novel, Contact, concluded that signal came from an intelligent source, and they set about to try to contact them. That's what the movie's all about. And I guarantee you, if we got such a signal today, that's exactly what we would do. We'd try to contact them, because they're probably smarter than we are. Okay. I'm saying to you, that kind of reasoning is perfectly good scientific reasoning. The problem is they haven't found anything. But right here on Earth, have we found something? Lots of things. What if they received a message from space that had a language in it that we could decode and read? I asked you that last night. Well, the fact is we found that right here on Earth in natural things. I told you the signature in the cell indicates very clearly, and lots of other texts, that in every living cell there is a language. Class, what is that language? What's the name of it? Say it louder. Yeah, DNA, but what's the code called? The genetic code. Do you remember that it consists of 4 letters that are taken 3 at a time? A, C, G, and T, right? Or in the case of RNA, it's A, C, G, and U. But it's a 4-letter language. And how long are all the words? 3-letter words. And we know exactly what every 3 letters means. They stand for amino acids and certain other signals that we know what they mean. So class, the thrust of last night, in case you've forgotten, was there's a multiplicity of evidence in the natural world that there is a language in natural events that we know how to read and decode. If that had been received from outer space, everybody would say that had an intelligent source. Why not say that in every cell? Something intelligent designed that. Period. Nature doesn't produce languages by itself. That's the argument. That was last night's lesson with a little added to it tonight. Especially this piece, because I wanted you to get a little math. This can be answered mathematically. Okay, so every living cell is full of signs of intelligent design, including a language which we've learned to decode and read, and research on DNA, where that language is contained, continues to reveal more and more signs of design. So why not say God did that? But a scientist like Richard Dawkins would say to you, if you say God did it, you've just stepped out of science. And he's right. Because science cannot investigate God directly. But can it look for evidence of design? Well, of course it can. We do it all the time. And doesn't design ultimately point to God? Dawkins says, no, it looks like it's designed, but it really isn't. But I say to you, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, when you get enough cases of design, how many does it take for you to finally be convinced there's a designer? That's the question. Yeah, that's probably right. All right. So, I showed you this last night. A little summary of what happens inside a cell. Here's the DNA with all the information. You remember it gets copied. That's called transcription. It is matured. The messenger RNA is matured, that it migrates outside the nuclear cell wall. It comes out here to the ribosomes and is read like a tape through a tape player, as it's translated, the protein is formed as a chain of amino acids. Summary of last night. Not only is there a language, ladies and gentlemen, but the language is used at an enormous rate to produce proteins, 200,000 per second, every living cell. Henry Ford, with his factories, never touched it. And nobody believes that Fords were not designed by somebody. This is way better than Fords. It's better than BMWs. Better than anything made by man. So tonight, I told you last night, we're going a different direction tonight. In 2000s, the early 2000s, particularly beginning specifically in 2003 and beyond, we set a goal for ourselves in the scientific community. It was, do you see what that says at the base? Resources for the biology century. You see, 2000 is being called the biology century because there's so many wonderful discoveries being made in the biological world. Not the least of which is the entire human genome has been mapped. That is one of the most phenomenal accomplishments of humankind, to map the entire human genome. It is humongous at a microscopic level. And it has taken a massive amount of work. Numerous chemists, biochemists around the world, working in groups over years and years of time, have finally mapped the entire human genome. And coming out of that has been some, how do I say this? Incredible information that we never knew before. So, I want to read you some quotes. My goal here is to make this look as awful as I can make it look. So I'm going to read you from some very noteworthy evolutionists. Ken Miller of Brown University, you may have heard of him. He's an outspoken critic of creationists like me. He wrote this. Please listen very closely. The human genome, that's all of your DNA and mine, is littered with pseudogenes, gene fragments, orphaned genes, junk DNA, and so many repeated copies of pointless DNA sequences that it cannot be attributed to anything that resembles intelligent design. If the DNA of a human being or any other organism resembled a carefully constructed computer program with neatly arranged and logically structured modules, each written to fulfill a specific function, the evidence of intelligent design would be overwhelming. In fact, the genome resembles nothing so much as a hodgepodge of borrowed, copied, mutated, and discarded sequences and commands that have been cobbled together by millions of years of trial and error against the relentless test of survival. It works, and it works brilliantly, not because of intelligent design, but because of the great blind power of natural selection to innovate, test, and discard what fails in favor of what succeeds. So what has come out of the Human Genome Project is a lot of folks saying most of DNA is a bunch of junk. And how does that testify to a designer? Oh, it does some neat things like build proteins, but it's mostly junk. Out of about 30,000 genes, for example, we humans carry more than 2,000 pseudogenes. Our genome and that of other species are truly well-populated graveyards of dead genes. And here's our favorite author, Richard Dawkins. He loves this. He wrote a book called The Greatest Show on Earth, The Evidence for Evolution. It is a remarkable fact, Dawkins wrote, that the greater part, 95% in the case of humans, of the genome might as well not be there for all the difference it makes. In particular, pseudogenes are genes that once did something useful, but now they have been sidelined and never transcribed or translated ever again. Dawkins concluded what pseudogenes are useful for is embarrassing creationists. It stretches even their creative ingenuity to make up a convincing reason why an intelligent designer should have created a pseudo-gene. Unless he was deliberately setting out to fool us. And you can believe Richard Dawkins has had a heyday with DNA. And does to this day. I'm calling this lesson Design at the Microscopic Level, the Signature in the Cell, and then I'm asking the question, what about junk DNA? Dawkins and numerous others like him say only about 5% of the DNA is used to build proteins. And the more we learn, the smaller that number gets. I've read some places where they think now less than 3% of the DNA is used to build proteins. This marvelous thing I described to you last night only uses about 3%, maybe 5%, of the DNA. What about the other 95%? Some say DNA is about 95% junk, like Richard Dawkins. And Ken Brown, a well-respected biologist, he's made that argument numerous times. As have a whole host of others, evolutionists who believe creationists are ignoramuses. And I already had confessed to you last night, didn't I? That I got hit with this without knowing what I was talking about. Can I take a little side trip here? If you want to support the cause of God's existence, then bite your tongue when you don't know what you're talking about. It only hurts the cause when you say stupid things, which you can't support. And a lot of creationists have done exactly that. You'd be better off to say nothing or to refer to somebody who has a little more knowledge about that subject. We're all ignorant, aren't we? Just in different fields. But if you know you're ignorant in a field, then you're better off not to say a whole lot because you hurt the cause. Anyway, in that particular instance, I had to confess I didn't know enough about that to speak on it, except to say you ought to be careful what you call junk. Because it may prove embarrassing to you one day that you call that junk. So, let me remind you, class, we had learned by the 1980s that RNA that copies the information off the DNA has little pieces in it that are called introns. Say that for me. Introns. Introns. As opposed to extrons. Introns means they were pieces of the copy that were inside of it. And that in the process of the transcription of the information, RNA was matured by editing out the introns. That's a fact, ladies and gentlemen. We know that happens. That was one thing that began to unfold that caused people to say, well, that doesn't look like a good design to me. Why would God make something that is going to be copied that has to be edited before you can use it? Why not just make it ready to copy and then go on? Seemed like a poor design. And that was an argument has been made. Introns are snipped out, and then what happens to them? Well, that's just a bunch of junk. Well, look, folks, I think we ought to be honest about stuff like this. That's bothersome to me as a creationist. If it is junk, I don't know how to answer why God would do that if he did it. My best answer is, let's wait a while and see what else we learn about it. And I think that's a pretty good answer. Because the fact is, we're ignorant about a whole lot of things. But that is a fact that we began to learn in the 80s, early 90s about this process. So introns were problematic. You see over here this ribosomal RNA and the transfer RNA. You see these pieces here? I don't have time to talk about those, but stuff's happening to them too. And they get sliced up and things happen. And the question is, why does that happen? Any engineer could do better than that. And do I need to say this again? There are 1,600 other things going on I haven't said one thing about, and I don't even know all of them. But there's a lot else going on also at the same time. So, let's keep back up here just a little bit. How do you explain introns? Well, for a long time we didn't know how to explain introns. Just looked like junk. And then when you add the human genome, where we've gone and actually mapped this entire genome for a human being, and for rabbits, and for monkeys, and a lot of other things. And what we found in there was a whole bunch of stuff that didn't look like it was worth much of anything. Whole sequences of repetitive stuff. And then pseudo-genes. Did you listen to that a while ago? They call them pseudo because they look like they were genes that one time were useful and now they're just not useful anymore. They're just sitting there. So why would God create a DNA with a bunch of pseudo genes in it? It's a good question. Now, before I go further, I want to tell you why I'm doing this. There will never be a time in the history of mankind until the Lord comes back again. There won't be things you don't know how to answer. Things about the natural world in particular. Because mankind is basically ignorant of a lot of stuff. There are always going to be things you don't know the answer to. And there will always be things that cause you, if you allow them to question your faith in God. Because in the Bible it says, Hebrews 11, verse 6, without faith it is impossible to please God. He who comes to God must, what? Believe that he is, and that he's a rewarder of those who diligently seek him. That means, class, it will never be the case where it is so certain from the outside evidence that there's no question, ever, because there will always have to be faith. You're going to have to believe it. Now, is that what Richard Dawkins says about it? He says, you Christians, what you do is this, and it's just, believe. It's blind faith. No, it is not. And that's never been God's design. He wants you to have evidence supportive of your faith, but you're always going to have to make a leap of faith sometime. But folks, that same thing is true no matter what position you take on origins. You're going to take a leap of faith sometime. You're going to believe it based on the evidence, but you're not going to know it with absolute certainty. So it doesn't matter what position you take. And my experience has been when I discuss with evolutionists, they cannot stand it when I tell them they have faith. No, we don't have faith, we have facts. We're dealing with science here. You folks are dealing with superstition and religion. No, every position on origins is a position of faith. Because at some point you have to step off and take a leap. Because you're not going to know with absolute certainty. I'm saying all that to you, and I'm making this point as hard as I know how to make it, because this is one like that, I think. It came along way late in our history. Nobody knew about this 10 years ago, well, 15 years ago. Now we do. And when it first came out and it started disturbing people, I didn't know how to answer this. But I'll tell you what I have learned. Just wait a few years. You have plenty of evidence to support your faith in God. If there's something you don't know how to answer, give it some time. Don't give up on your foundational faith. And the same thing's true with this. This is a classic example, folks. And look, when I get finished with this discussion in a few minutes, we still have a whole lot we don't know. I confess ignorance in a whole lot of things. And ignorance on how to explain some things. But I think we ought to be honest about that. Don't tell your kids things like you've got it all figured out. They'll catch that quickly, folks, and it'll hurt the cause of our Lord. Be honest about it. So, what do we do about this? Well, I want to introduce you to another little book. It's called The Myth of Junk DNA. Isn't that interesting? It's by Jonathan Wells. He's a well-respected biochemist. And he, in this book, explores, let me look at the copyright date on this one. I've forgotten. It's not that long ago, though. 2011. So pretty current. This book is full of quotations from scientists who are doing experiments in scientific laboratories around the world, showing what the supposed junk DNA does. You listening? I didn't think junk did anything. But what we're learning is junk does all kinds of stuff, at least things they call junk. So my goal for the next few minutes, and please, I ask the forgiveness of every living cell for the incomplete, inadequate treatment I'm about to give this subject. You need to look deeper. But I want to just skim the top. There's evidence for specific biological functions of non-protein coding DNA. What do you mean non-protein coding? Only parts of the DNA code for protein. In fact, we think it's less than 5%. So what's the rest of it doing? That's the non-protein coding part. Well, there's a lot of evidence building that it does stuff. RNAs from this DNA play significant roles in controlling whether, where, and to what extent protein coding regions are transcribed. Now I know I lost you. What's the rest of that DNA? It's also being copied. And it's making RNAs. Folks, we don't know yet how many different kinds of RNAs there are.
Different instructions.
Yeah. It may not be instructions for making proteins, but there are RNAs being made, and if there's RNAs being made, they're doing something. And we're beginning to learn what they do. And it's absolutely fascinating. You young kids, listen to me. I want your eyes on me, kids. Look at me. You are going to discover what happens with some of those RNAs, I hope, and become world famous. Don't be afraid of science. If you let science lead you properly, it'll lead you closer to God. We're learning that there's bunches of RNAs being made we don't know much about yet. But it clearly indicates they're doing something. So you see up here, there's 3 different kinds of RNA: messenger, ribosomal and transfer. Folks, that is so outdated now. We already know of a whole bunch of RNAs. I yell so you get my point. And by the way, while you're looking at this, you see those little introns there? They make RNAs, among other things. They're little pieces of DNA, right? That have been copied. It's utterly fascinating. Be careful what you call junk. Introns have specific functions. They're rich in splicing factor recognition sites. They encode a majority of the small RNAs. RNAs from introns influence gene expression by modifying chromatin. You don't have to remember all that. Just remember introns are doing stuff. And can I summarize it this way, class? The engineers thought, well, why would you snip out this stuff and have to put it back together again before you can copy it? You know what we're learning? We're learning that having those introns in there gives you an infinite variety of the way you can do things. Listen to me closely. We have learned that there are editosomes and spliceosomes. Those are specific, thank you, they remembered, proteins who can snip out introns and sew them back together, spliceosomes, right? So that from the same piece of DNA, you can have the information to make as many as 1,000 different proteins from the same piece. How's that for design? It's utterly incredible. Snip out the introns and put them together in different ways, and you can produce several different things from the same snippet. So the introns are not only valuable, they provide a massive more amount of information in the same piece. And we're just beginning to learn about all this stuff. Don't talk to me about introns being junk. Shame on you. You think we've touched the hem of the garment on that page? Here's another fascinating thing, ladies and gentlemen. There are multiple messages stored in the same sequence of bases. Spliceosomes and editosomes, codes within codes, dual and overlapping messages. I don't know if I can find this in my book, so I'm just going to tell you the story. During the Revolutionary War, there was a woman, a mama, who lived at home while her husband was off in battle. And she would write him letters periodically. And it was letters about their family, about the farm, about weather, how things were going. And if you just read the letter, you'd think, this is a nice letter from home telling hubby about wife and kids and the farm. But inside that letter, if you knew the code, you could learn where the local army was, where they were keeping their munitions, when they were moving next. And so you'd know ahead of time what you needed to do to defend yourself against that army. In the same letter. The letter was a letter from home from Mama. But inside was a code that told you very important military secrets. There's a name for that. Does anybody know? Okay, that's another teaser. Say it again? Yes, sir. Don't say it too loud. I want them to have to look it up. This is a talent. Not just everybody can do this, right? I mean, it takes a brilliant person to put a code inside of a code. Now, inside the DNA, we know very well there are codes inside of codes. So isn't it interesting how natural selection, acting through the blind forces of physics, could produce codes inside of codes? Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, can you honestly believe that codes inside of codes came about without intelligence? Well, that's part of what's happening in that junk. DNA. Pseudogenes. Let me tell you another example. You have a gene in you that's basically in the same place on your DNA as the one in rabbits that produces vitamin C. The one in rabbits still works. So the rabbit produces vitamin C with that gene. Your gene doesn't work. Well, you know what the evolutionist says about that. As you were evolving from lower creatures over time, your genes mutated to the point that that gene doesn't work anymore. Folks, do mutations happen in nature? Don't deny facts. Can I get on a little side trip here? I understand that, but I want to give you another example. Did you know Christians used to deny there were such things as dinosaurs and that those fossils were real? Folks, if you argue with facts, you're going to lose every time. Don't argue with facts. And it is a fact, what I've just told you. Now, is it a fact that the pseudogene on the human DNA and the one on the rabbit DNA are really connected with one another some way? That's not established. It looks like that might be implied. And is it a fact that DNA has been mutated numerous times? Don't you deny that, because it happens a lot. In fact, one of our serious health issues these days is mutations. Yeah, over time. How does a Christian deal with mutations? Can I just get off on that a minute? Does the fact that something's been mutated mean it wasn't ever designed in the first place? No, it means that the things designed in the first place can break down because of the properties of nature. That doesn't mean it wasn't designed in the first place, does it? I don't think so. If that's the case, cars were not designed either. They're breaking down all the time because things in nature tend to make things deteriorate. So don't deny mutations. They happen. I would deny things being called junk, though. I'd be really careful about that, because that implies there wasn't design. Some of these pseudogenes we've learned produce functional proteins. So are they really pseudogenes? Not if they produce functional proteins. Some produce RNAs that suppress the expression of their corresponding functional genes, and some produce RNAs that increase the expression of the corresponding functional genes. In other words, we are learning that those supposed pseudogenes are doing stuff. So are they pseudo or are they not? You see? So be careful what you call junk. You should better say, let's wait and see what we find out. What about long interspersed nuclear elements? They call them lines, and short interspersed nuclear elements, and endogenous retroviruses. How's that for a nice word? These are all things the evolutionists say are evidence that this stuff was just cobbled together by evolutionary change over time, and it just happens to work the way it does because nature has picked out the things that function. The rest of it is left as junk. Why else would you have long interspersed areas, a bunch of repetition? It's like the desert that seems to be doing nothing. Well, I can tell you what's starting to be learned is that those long spaces of desert have some function, kind of like our deserts do, inside the DNA. So even these are beginning to be understood to have some functions for us. And now we're learning that the files within folders system to make retrieving, manipulating, and expressing rich data more efficient. We know now that inside the DNA there are similar things to words, sentences, paragraphs, folders, superfolders, isocores. How does your desk look at home? Mine's a mess. If you don't organize all the information you have, it's hard to get at it, isn't it? You never saw anything more complex than a DNA, and it's all wrapped around itself in tight-knit How do you get that thing to function? What we're learning is it's got things built into it that organize it so it just functions like a well-oiled machine. It has way more information in it than we ever dreamed. And somehow it gets it out of there and in there and functions. By the way, did you know it has self-repairing properties? It's amazing. The more we learn about supposed junk DNA, the more it appears to be designed. Do I have all the answers to all that stuff? No. There's a lot of things still to answer and investigate, but it's exciting because we're starting to see the junk is not really junk. And maybe there's a whole lot more to learn. How many in this room have somebody that's had or has cancer? Okay. We have a research hospital down my way in Tampa that is researching how to use your own immune system to fight cancer. We had one of the people from that research center come and speak to our Rotary Club the other day. And his comment to us was, "This is the most exciting time of my life." Because we are opening up more and more ways we can use the properties of the human body that are somehow put in there, I would say designed by God, to help defeat cancer. And one of those is, there's going to be a time when they can map your whole DNA, your personal one. It already can happen. It's pretty expensive. And then they will know in your case, depending on how much they've learned by then, that here's a piece of your DNA that has been mutated or somehow is not functioning properly, and maybe even help that. Right? And then help your body to fight off disease. Amazing stuff. It's possible. Yes. Has it happened with your case? Tell us a little bit about it.
Just when we first started out with Nathan and his retinoblastoma, one of the things that they did was test his DNA and find out where the cancer was. And they don't know all the information, but like you said, they're using it to help with treatment.
Amazing stuff. So I say glory be to God. Folks, the evidence for design in the natural world is overwhelming. So why not say there was a grand designer? Look, that's not stepping out of science. That's recognizing the power of what science has revealed. And our position as creationists is not based on ignorance. The more we know, the more powerful the case gets. It's not based on ignorance. It may have been at one time, but it's not now. That's my message to you, the same one Michael Behe said in his book, Darwin's Black Box. Everywhere we look, from the macroscopic to the microscopic, things look like they're made. Isn't that what Romans 1:20 said? You examine the things that are made. Look, class, if you get a signal from outer space with the genetic code in it, somebody made that. And it wasn't nature by itself with natural selection acting on the blind forces of physics. Everywhere you look, it looks like things are made. I say it's a grand testimony to the eternal Maker. And that's tonight's lesson. Probably like a duck. Thank you for your good attention. I didn't see anybody falling asleep tonight either. You're amazing people, because I've talked for an hour and 10 minutes here almost. Thank you. I hope you are inspired by the testimony of God's other book. You don't need the Bible to become a believer in God. God has left plenty of evidence in the natural world.